Irish vampire. The foyer floorboards groaned, a sound like splintering bone, as Rachel took a tentative step into the gloom. The air here didn't smell like a house that had been abandoned for years. It smelled of stagnant copper and ozone, the scent of a storm trapped in a box. "You okay?" Sarah's voice was a jagged thread, stripped of the playful sarcasm she'd used to mock the haunted rumors just 10 minutes ago. She stayed close, her shoulder brushing Rachel's, their flashlights casting frantic, erratic cones of light against peeling wallpaper that looked uncomfortably like flayed skin. Rachel gripped her own light, the casing slick with sweat. "It's just the house. It feels like it's holding its breath. Let's just grab a photo of the parlor, prove we were here, and get back to the boat," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting toward the grand staircase. The architecture seemed to defy geometry, the hallway angled sharply, stretching toward the shadows in a way that made the inner ear scream for equilibrium. "This place is giving me a migraine. The vibes are radioactive." "I don't think we're being watched by ghosts, Sarah," Rachel murmured, her heart thudding against her ribs with a cadence that felt wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. She felt a strange, cold vibration deep in her marrow, a hum that resonated with the very foundation of the building. "It's like the house is hungry." They moved deeper, passing beneath a heavy, velvet-draped archway that led to the drawing room. Every shadow seemed to detach itself from the corners, clinging to the edges of their vision. The silence was absolute, a pressurized vacuum that made the simple act of breathing feel like a chore. "Look at the dust," Rachel said, pointing her beam at the floor. The carpet was thick with grime, but there were no footprints, only theirs, cutting fresh, stark paths through the gray velvet layer of time. "If people come here to urban explore, where are they?" "It's completely pristine." Sarah didn't answer. She had stopped dead, her flashlight beam fixed on a portrait hanging above the mantel. It was a painting of a man whose face had been systematically scratched away, the canvas shredded by something with long, hooked claws. "Rachel," she said, her voice dropping to a tremor. "My phone. It's dead. Again." Rachel checked her own. Nothing. The digital interface, which had been at full battery when they docked, now flickered with a distorted, dying pixelated static before going black. The temperature plummeted. It wasn't the slow, creeping cold of autumn, it was an instantaneous drop, the kind that turned breath into thick, white plumes of fog. "We need to leave." "Now," Rachel said, the hair on her arms standing straight up. The house shifted, the deep, tectonic groan of timber and stone. They both spun around, looking back toward the foyer, but the entrance they had just walked through was gone. In its place was a solid, windowless wall of rotting oak paneling. "No, no, no," Sarah fumbled, hitting the wall with her palms. It felt like cold, wet meat rather than wood. "This isn't right. We just came through here. Where's the door?" "Sarah, don't touch it," Rachel warned, the dread turning into a sharp, metallic tang at the back of her throat. The darkness in the room began to thicken, coalescing into a singular, dense point near the ceiling. It wasn't an absence of light, it was a presence of something else, something that exuded a predatory gravity. The house wasn't haunted by spirits of the dead, it was a hunting ground, and they were the bait. Rachel backed away, her hand catching Sarah's arm. Her senses were sharpening in the dark, the edges of her vision pulling in light from sources that shouldn't exist. She could see the dust motes dancing, the individual fibers of the drapes, and the faint, pulsating aura of black energy emanating from the walls. It was a sickening, electric realization. She could feel the magic. "Something is here," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide, locked on the shifting shadows. "I know," Sarah whimpered, her knuckles white as she gripped her flashlight like a weapon. "I can feel it too. It's like being stared at by something that's already decided how I'm going to die." A soft, rhythmic clicking sound started, like nails tapping on marble, coming from the rafters above. It wasn't the sound of a settling house. It was the sound of something calculating. Rachel shifted into a defensive stance, the latent, dormant power in her bloodline beginning to surge, a wildfire igniting in her veins. She didn't know what it was, only that it was ancient, and it was screaming at her to fight. "Stay behind me," Rachel commanded, her voice suddenly steady, infused with a strange, unnatural resonance that made Sarah freeze in shock. "Rachel, your eyes," Sarah started, but her sentence was cut short by a sound like a wet whip cracking through the air. The ceiling shadows exploded downward. The house didn't just rattle, it shrieked in response to the movement. The hunt had officially begun. The silence of the foyer was not an absence of sound, it was a weight. It pressed against their eardrums like deep-sea pressure. Rachel's flashlight beam cut through the stagnant air, revealing dust motes that hung suspended, motionless, as if the house itself had held its breath for a century. "Okay," Rachel whispered, the sound too loud in the dead air. "This is officially creepier than the blog implied. Can we just take the photos and go?" Sarah, trailing a step behind, tightened her grip on her camera. The floorboards didn't even creak when we stepped inside. "That's not normal, Ratch. It's like the wood is trying to be invisible." Before Rachel could reply, the darkness at the top of the grand staircase didn't just shift, it detached itself. It was a blur of motion, a predatory arc of gray and black. There was no sound of footsteps, only the distinct, sharp thrum of displaced air. Rachel barely had time to pivot before a force like a runaway train slammed into her. The impact sent her flying backward, her flashlight spinning away to skitter across the floor, its beam flashing wildly against the peeling wallpaper like a dying star. She hit the far wall, the breath driven out of her lungs in a jagged wheeze. Mark materialized above her, his presence a sudden, freezing chill that stole the heat from the room. He was lithe, his Irish features twisted into a mockery of a smile, his eyes glowing with a faint, necrotic luminescence. He moved with a languid, terrifying grace that suggested he wasn't just fast, he was outside the normal rhythm of time. "So many visitors," Mark hissed. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "And such vibrant, pulsing warmth." Sarah screamed, a raw, jagged sound that died in her throat as she lunged forward to pull him off. It was a mistake. Mark didn't even look at her. He merely flicked a wrist, a backhanded motion so casual it was insulting. Sarah was caught mid-stride, lifted off her feet by an invisible kinetic wave, and hurled against the oak banister. The wood groaned, splintered, and held. Sarah slumped to the floor, her vision blurring at the edges, her limbs unresponsive as if the air around her had turned into hardening resin. She watched, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and agonizing terror, as Rachel struggled beneath the vampire. Rachel kicked out, her boot connecting with Mark's chest, but it was like kicking a marble statue. He grabbed her ankle, his grip bruisingly firm, his fingernails digging into her jeans. "You're not supposed to be here, little bird," he murmured, leaning down. His breath smelled of stagnant water and old, copper-rich blood. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She clawed at his face, her fingernails catching the pale, cold skin, but he didn't flinch. He pinned her wrists above her head with one hand, his weight settling over her with the crushing inevitability of a tomb lid. "Get off," she gasped, her voice trembling but fierce. She felt the supernatural chill seeping through her clothes, a numbing frost that made her blood feel like it was turning to slush. Mark laughed, a low, rattling sound in his throat. He shifted, his head dipping low, his posture shifting from that of a predator to that of a collector. He didn't attack with fury, he attacked with a terrifying, clinical precision. "The silence of this island is a gift," he whispered, his face inches from her neck. "It means no one will hear the music when you finally scream." Rachel tried to buck him off, her latent, hidden energy, the spark she had never known she possessed, flickering in the base of her skull like a faulty electrical wire. It surged, a sudden, searing heat, but the vampire's sheer, oppressive aura smothered it before it could manifest. She was trapped in the cold, staring up at the dark, hollow eyes of a creature that viewed her not as a human, but as a vessel. She could feel his heartbeat, or the lack thereof. It was a rhythmic, subterranean thumping, a mechanical pulse that resonated with the house itself. Sarah, fighting the paralysis, tried to drag herself across the floor. Her fingers scraped against the dust. "Rachel," she choked out, her voice a pathetic ghost of her usual defiance. Mark glanced toward Sarah, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. He didn't want to be interrupted. He turned his attention back to Rachel, his jaw unhinging slightly, a predatory display that defied human anatomy. "Don't worry," Mark whispered to Rachel, his voice dropping into a hypnotic, velvet register that made her head swim. "The first part is always the hardest. After that, you'll wonder why you were ever afraid of the dark." The darkness of the house seemed to coil around them, thickening, turning the hallway into a claustrophobic cage. Rachel's struggle began to weaken, not from lack of will, but from the encroaching, unnatural sleepiness that Mark's presence forced upon her senses. Her vision tunneled. The last thing she saw before the world tipped into the abyss was the glint of Mark's teeth in the dim, erratic light of the flashlight on the floor. The floorboards groaned, not under their weight, but like the house itself was taking a shallow, ragged breath. Rachel was pressed against the mahogany wainscoting, her lungs burning, the metallic tang of blood already heavy in the air. Mark was a blur of predatory motion, his pale, aristocratic features twisted into a rictus of hunger. He wasn't just a man, he was a famine given human skin. He moved with an unnatural, jarring fluidity that defied physics. One moment he was 6 feet away, and the next, his ice-cold hand was clamped around Rachel's throat, pinning her to the wall. The impact rattled her teeth. The sheer force of it, the way his fingers sank into her flesh like hot iron into wax, stripped away the last of her rational thought. She clawed at his wrist, her fingernails scraping against his granite-hard skin, but she might as well have been scratching at a tombstone. "You smell of curiosity," Mark whispered, his voice a jagged rasp that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "And beneath that? Terror. It's the finest seasoning." Across the foyer, Sarah was pinned under the crushing weight of debris and the predatory gaze of Jack, who stood over her with the casual, terrifying grace of a predator toying with a trapped bird. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide, darting from Rachel to the doorway, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her body remained shackled by a primal, lizard brain paralysis. She watched, horrified, as Mark leaned in, his lips curling back to reveal fangs that shimmered like polished obsidian in the moonlight filtering through the shattered windows. Rachel's vision began to tunnel. The world narrowed down to the heat of his breath and the terrifying magnetism of those eyes. "Look at me, little moth," Mark hissed. He didn't wait for her to comply. He lunged. The bite was not a cinematic graze, it was an intrusion. It was a searing, white-hot agony that bypassed her nerves and attacked the very concept of her soul. Rachel shrieked, a sound that started in the deepest part of her chest and tore its way out, ragged and raw. It felt as though a cold, viscous liquid was being pumped directly into her veins, a freezing toxin that burned with a sickly, ancient sentience. The house seemed to react to the sound, the shadows in the corners of the room lengthening, undulating like oil on water. She slumped against the wall, her legs turning to water. Mark pulled back, a jagged line of crimson trailing from his mouth, his eyes glowing with an unholy, triumphant light. He looked less like a man and more like a starving wolf. "The seal is broken," he murmured, stepping back to admire his work. Sarah, seeing the light fade from Rachel's eyes, felt a snap, the sound of her own humanity fracturing under the weight of sheer, unadulterated shock. The paralyzing fear that had pinned her to the floor shattered into a frantic, chaotic need for survival. She saw the debris Jack had pinned her with, a heavy, rotted oak side table, and realized it wasn't heavy enough to hold her if she pushed with everything she had. With a guttural cry of defiance, Sarah heaved. The wood groaned and splintered. Jack glanced over, his smile widening, amused by her desperate exertion. He took a languid step toward her, his hand reaching out like a claw, but he miscalculated. Sarah didn't wait for him to reach her. She shoved the splintered wood upward with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled desperation, hitting Jack squarely in the solar plexus. It wasn't a killing blow, not even close, but it startled him, forcing him to exhale in a sharp, surprised hiss. That split second of hesitation was all she needed. She scrambled backward, clawing at the dust-covered floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She caught a glimpse of Rachel, slumped, limp, her skin turning a ghastly, translucent shade of gray, her veins darkening like ink spreading through clear water. "Rachel!" Sarah screamed, but the name caught in her throat, strangled by the overwhelming sense of loss. Rachel didn't answer. Her head lolled forward, her hair masking her face, but the rhythmic, uneven rise and fall of her chest was stuttering. The house itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her dying heart. "Run, little rabbit," Mark chuckled, his attention shifting to Sarah. He didn't chase her yet. He stood still, savoring the scent of her fear as it filled the room like incense. He wanted the chase. He wanted the slow realization that there was nowhere left to go. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her boots slipping on the slick, dust-covered floor. She didn't look back at the monsters, she looked at the door. The foyer, once a path to curiosity, was now the threshold of a tomb. She crashed through the frame, the wooden door slamming shut behind her with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid clicking into place. Outside, the island was a nightmare of silence. The lake reflected the moonlight like a jagged shard of glass. Sarah sprinted, her breath hitching, her lungs burning, her mind a strobe light of trauma. Behind her, the house groaned, a sound that wasn't structural, but vocal, a low, satisfied vibration that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. She reached the edge of the water, where the boat had been tied, where it was supposed to be. It was gone. The realization hit her harder than the vampire's grip. She was trapped. She spun around, staring back at the towering, decrepit silhouette of the mansion. The windows glowed with an amber, flickering light, as if 1,000 candles had suddenly been lit in the dark. She stood there in the mud and the reeds, the cold wind whipping her hair across her tear-streaked face. She wasn't just a student on a ghost hunt anymore. She was a witness to an extinction event. Her best friend was in there, being unmade, being folded into the dark. Sarah slumped to her knees, the damp earth soaking through her jeans. She grabbed a handful of cold, wet sand, her knuckles white. She wouldn't let it end here. She didn't know how she was going to get off this rock, and she didn't know how she was going to stop the things that were currently hollow out Rachel's soul, but the fear was slowly, terrifyingly, crystallizing into a hard, cold resolve. From the upper floors of the house, a long, drawn-out sound pierced the night. It wasn't a scream. It was a high, keening note that sounded like metal grinding against glass, climbing in pitch until it vanished into the wind. It was the sound of something waking up. Sarah stood up, her legs shaking, and turned her back on the house. She looked out toward the distant, faint lights of the mainland, miles away across the black water. "I'm coming back for you," she whispered to the wind. As if in response, the lights in the mansion flickered once, twice, and then went completely dark. The house stood silent, a monolithic tombstone against the starless sky. Sarah began to walk, following the perimeter of the lake, searching for anything, a stray dinghy, a crate, a miracle, knowing that the world she had woken up in that morning had ceased to exist, and the one that had replaced it would demand a price she wasn't sure she could pay. Deep inside the house, in the center of the dark, something shifted. Rachel's hand, resting on the floor, twitched. Then, very slowly, her fingers curled into a fist, the nails digging into the wood, leaving deep, gouged marks in the ancient, rotted timber. The transformation had begun, and the island, once silent, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the predator to rise.